When Chadwick Preston first breezed into Verity Systems, all polished smiles and empty promises, I knew Boston's autumn chill wouldn't be the only cold front hitting us. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air as I leaned back against the cool glass wall of the conference room, watching him sweep through the doorway like a man certain the world owed him something. His suit looked like it had been pressed by angels. His watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights. And that grin, smooth, sharp-edged, and utterly empty, flashed too easily as he clapped his hands once to get everyone's attention. "Exciting times ahead," Chad declared, his voice riding the thin line between enthusiasm and command. I caught Maggie's eye across the room. She gave the slightest shake of her head, a silent warning. We'd seen this show before. Verity Systems had survived 3 acquisitions, 2 mergers, and a near bankruptcy in the last decade. Through it all, we'd kept the servers humming, the contracts signed, the clients satisfied. But men like Chad thought history started the day they walked in. As he launched into a monologue about vision realignment and agile synergy, I felt the temperature in the room drop lower than the October wind rattling against the windows. His words were slick, but his understanding of Verity's backbone, the very system it ran on, was thinner than the paper cups we drank from. I thought about the old Verity, the Verity where a Friday evening meant pizza boxes stacked in the lounge and engineers scribbling on whiteboards until midnight. The place where Mrs. Delaney, the diner owner across the street, would deliver pies to the office on Thanksgiving week, just because you kids are working too hard. That Verity had been built by people like me, invisible people. Chad didn't see us. He saw lines on a spreadsheet, numbers to trim. "We're going to streamline operations," he said, pacing before the wall of glass like a motivational speaker. "Lean, fast, efficient. Dead weight will be eliminated." I crossed my arms over my chest and listened, careful not to flinch. From the corner of my eye, I saw 2 interns whispering to each other, their faces pale. Even Maggie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "And leadership," Chad added, pausing for dramatic effect, "will be evaluated based on adaptability, not tenure." There it was, the first warning shot. As the meeting broke, he made a beeline toward me, his Rolex catching the overhead lights like a little sun. "Clear, right?" he said, offering a hand I didn't take. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you bring to the new Verity." I smiled, the kind of smile you reserve for weathering hurricanes and arrogant fools alike. "Should be educational," I said. That afternoon, Chad began dismantling the weekly technical review meetings. In their place, vision syncs. Mandatory, of course. PowerPoints thick with buzzwords and empty graphics replaced meaningful dialogue about code stability and server load. On Wednesday, the first reorg email hit inboxes like a punch. 2 senior managers reassigned. No warning, no thank you for years of service, just a 2-paragraph memo and a final paycheck. At lunch, I sat by the window at Mrs. Delaney's diner, picking at a turkey club while rain streaked the glass. Across the street, Verity's building loomed gray and impersonal against the churning sky. Maggie slid into the booth across from me without a word and dropped a folded piece of paper on the table, a printed copy of the new org chart. "He's moving fast," she said, pushing her hair behind one ear. Her wedding ring tapped nervously against her coffee cup. I scanned the chart. My name was still there, for now. "He doesn't know," Maggie said quietly, reading my face. "He doesn't care," I corrected her, setting the paper aside. Outside, a gust of wind sent leaves skittering across the sidewalk like a warning. Thursday's all-hands meeting felt more like a courtroom than a town hall. Chad stood on the small stage, microphone clipped to his lapel, a digital slide behind him displaying the word transformation. "And we need agile minds," he said, looking pointedly at my side of the room, "not anchors weighing down progress." There it was again, another public shot across the bow. I smiled politely, the way you do when you see someone dancing on thin ice, and you know the thaw is coming. By Thursday, the only thing moving faster than the falling leaves outside was the revolving door of Verity Systems. I slid my ID badge across the scanner and stepped into the office, the heavy glass door sighing shut behind me. The lobby, usually buzzing with morning chatter and the clatter of hurried footsteps, felt eerily subdued. Even the receptionist, a cheerful woman named Dana, who used to greet everyone with a happy Thursday, barely managed a tight-lipped nod. A notification pinged on my phone as I made my way to my desk, another all-staff email. I tapped it open without break and stride. Subject, organizational streamline and update. There it was, the newest euphemism for layoffs. They hadn't even waited a full week. I glanced around. Faces I had seen every day for years were missing. Desks stood empty, a few still holding personal effects. Half-drunk mugs of coffee, photos of kids taped to monitors, abandoned office plants already beginning to droop. I saw Maggie hovering near the break room, her arms crossed tight across her chest, her expression grim. I dropped my bag onto my chair and opened my laptop. No new meeting invites, no review sessions scheduled, no updates to project timelines, just silence. By mid-morning, the whispers started. Chad had fired 2 senior developers by email. No meetings, no handshakes, just a "thank you for your service" note attached to their final paycheck. One of them, Jackson, had built the customer portal system that still generated 40% of our revenue streams. At lunch, I wandered down to Mrs. Delaney's diner again. She refilled my coffee twice without asking, sliding a slice of pumpkin pie across the table with a wink. "You look like you could use it, honey," she said, pressing the warm plate into my hands. Outside, the trees were a blur of orange and red, a fierce, almost defiant burst of color against the gray sky. I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, feeling the familiar weight settle in my chest. This wasn't just a leadership shift, it was a cultural collapse. When I returned to my desk, I found the email waiting for me. Subject, organizational changes. I clicked it open, and there it was, in cold, sanitized corporate language. "Claire Whitmore, your role has been determined redundant. Effective immediately. No meeting, no handshake. Not even the courtesy of a conversation. Just a digital shove out the door." My pulse didn't spike. My hands didn't tremble. I simply sat back in my chair and let the silence settle around me like an old coat. I powered down my laptop and reached for the thick navy blue folder tucked into the bottom drawer, the one I had kept out of habit more than paranoia. Inside, a certified copy of my employment contract, a notarized copy of the back-end system's patent registration, and a quietly powerful clause that Chad, in all his brilliance, had clearly never bothered to read. I packed my desk slowly, my coffee mug, a ceramic owl Maggie had given me years ago. The little succulent that somehow survived neglect and office air conditioning. A framed photo of the team from 3 Christmases ago, back when Verity had still felt like family. The interns watched me go, wide-eyed and silent. I offered them a small smile, a silent message. Pay attention. This is how the real world works. In the elevator, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored wall. Calm, composed, not defeated. I crossed the lobby under the flickering light of the old Verity Systems logo, each step deliberate against the marble floor. Outside, the late October rain had picked up, turning the sidewalks slick and glossy. I pulled my coat tighter around me and tucked the folder under my arm. The city bustled around me, oblivious to the small rupture in my world. A woman in a Red Sox beanie hurried past, balancing a tray of takeout coffees. A cab splashed through a puddle, sending a spray of water up onto the curb. Somewhere down the block, a busker played a soft tune on an old guitar, the notes thin against the thickening mist. I stopped under the awning of a bookstore, letting the soft pluck of strings soak into my bones. Then, steadying myself, I slipped the patent paperwork into my messenger bag and turned toward home. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was a luxury for people who didn't have leverage. Instead, I felt something sharper, more focused, opportunity. As I crossed Boylston Street, the streetlights flickered on one by one, tiny amber halos cutting through the early twilight. Boston's autumn wrapped itself around me, familiar and bracing. I could smell the faint cinnamon spice from the bakery down the corner and hear the rustle of dry leaves skimming the pavement. Tomorrow I will act. Tomorrow I would remind Verity Systems exactly what they had thrown away. I packed my plant, my laptop, and something Chad hadn't bothered to read, the contract that would unravel his empire. The weekend rolled in wrapped in mist and quiet defiance. I had a plan, and Monday had a reckoning scheduled. I spent Saturday morning at my tiny kitchen table, the one wedged against the window overlooking South End's winding alleys and brick sidewalks. The table was scarred from years of coffee cups and scribbled notes, but today it served as my war room. The blue folder lay open before me, its contents neatly stacked: patent registration, license and agreement, employment contract, a trail of signatures and legal terms that most people skimmed, but I had memorized. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth. Outside, the city moved at half speed. The air smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke, the streets crowded with tourists snapping pictures of the autumn colors, their voices muffled by the steady drizzle. The document was clear. Verity Systems held a licensing agreement to use the back-end system, but that agreement expired this very Sunday at midnight, unless renewed with my explicit consent. No consent, no system. No system, no company. Simple math. Still, I wasn't rushing. Precision mattered more than speed. I bundled up and headed out mid-morning, walking past the iron-fenced parks and golden-leaved trees. Vendors sold hot cider on corners. Shop windows gleamed with early Thanksgiving displays. It should have felt festive. Instead, the city carried the heavy quiet of a storm waiting offshore. Stopping by Mrs. Delaney's diner for a late breakfast, I found her wiping down the counter, radio humming soft 60s jazz in the background. "Back so soon?" she said, sliding a coffee across without being asked. I offered a wry smile. "Figured I could use the strong stuff today." She chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "Pie's on the house if you want it. You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world." I accepted the slice, apple, thick with cinnamon, and sat at the corner booth. The walls around me were cluttered with photos, high school teams, veterans parades, Thanksgiving dinners dating back decades. Real lives, real work, not the plastic leadership Chad peddled. As I ate, I thought about the interns, their wide eyes as they watched me pack my desk, the small nods from people too afraid to speak, Maggie's tight, worried smile, all the pieces of a company that people like Chad never noticed until they crumbled. By early afternoon, I was back home. I drafted the email carefully, each word measured, each citation precise. I attached the key documents, outlined the expiration terms, and set the subject line: Notice of Intellectual Property Licensing. Expiration, immediate attention required. I didn't write it with anger, I wrote it with clarity. No accusations, no dramatic flair, just facts, laid bare. Before hitting send, I sat back for a moment, breathing in the damp air seeping through the old window panes. A Red Sox flag flapped lazily from the neighboring balcony. Somewhere, a car honked twice in quick succession, the city's heartbeat slow but steady. I pressed send. The message went to Verity's legal department, CC'd to Chad, HR, and, because a little insurance never hurt, the corporate compliance officer. Afterward, I closed my laptop and pulled on my jacket. There was nothing more to do today. The dominoes were set. All that remained was to let gravity do its work. I walked through the public garden, boots crunching over damp leaves, the pond shrouded in mist. Couples huddled under umbrellas, children in raincoats splashed through puddles. Life moved on, oblivious. By the time I returned home, twilight had slipped over the city, turning streetlights into blurry halos. My inbox was quiet, too quiet. Sunday morning came with a heavy sky, bruised and swollen with the threat of rain. I brewed strong coffee, black and unadorned, and settled in by the window with a worn paperback I barely read. Waiting wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Around noon, the first email landed, from HR. "We are seeking clarification regarding your notice. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." 2 hours later, another one, this time from legal. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss the terms of your prior agreements to ensure continued operations. And finally, just before midnight, a short, panicked note from Chad himself. Emma, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Please call me ASAP so we can resolve this. I didn't respond. The clock struck 12, and with it, Verity's right to use my system expired. I sipped my coffee and stared out into the foggy Boston night, watching the city hold its breath. When the first frantic call came on Monday morning, I just sipped my coffee and smiled. The storm had arrived right on schedule. At precisely 8:07 a.m., Verity systems crashed, and it wasn't just the servers that froze. I had just set my second cup of coffee on the windowsill when the first email alert lit up my phone, then another and another. By the time I refreshed the screen, it looked like a slot machine had exploded. System error. Back-end authentication failed. Client access portal down. Internal reporting. Tool critical failure. I stood by the window, mug warm in my hands, as Boston's gray morning light spilled across the brick streets below. A misty drizzle clung to the air, softening the world's hard edges. Somewhere, a church bell chimed 8 times, a slow, somber toll. 7 minutes later, my personal cell rang. I recognized the number immediately, Verity's main line. I let it ring out, twice. The third time, it was Maggie's number. I answered. "You did it, didn't you?" she said, half whisper, half awe. "I didn't do anything," I replied, voice even. "I just stopped holding it together for them." "They're losing it up here," she said. A muffled shout in the background. "Chad's been pacing since 7. IT is tearing their hair out. Clients are calling nonstop." I thanked her quietly and hung up before she could say more. Maggie was smart. She knew better than to get caught in the crossfire. My inbox continued to flood, HR asking for urgent clarification, legal requesting an immediate consultation, Chad demanding a call to resolve misunderstandings. The thing about leverage is, once you know you have it, the trick is patience. By 9, I had crafted a response, polite, professional, devastatingly firm. I outlined the licensing expiration, cited the specific clauses, and attached copies for their convenience. I offered my terms, $1.2 million licensing fee for 1 year, renewable quarterly, public acknowledgement of my patent on all internal and external documentation, full system support provided only through my consultancy or an approved partner. I didn't bluff, I didn't threaten. I simply stated the cost of their negligence. I hit send. Across the city, under the cold fluorescence of Verity's 7th floor executive suites, I could almost hear the silence settle like dust after an explosion. I pulled on my coat and walked to the diner. The streets shimmered with rain, neon signs blurring into watercolor smudges. Inside, Mrs. Delaney greeted me with a raised eyebrow and a fresh cup of coffee. "Trouble brewing, sugar?" she asked, topping off my mug. "Not my trouble," I said, and meant it. As I stirred a little cream into my cup, the door chimed and a handful of Verity employees stumbled in, voices low and frantic. I caught snippets: server crash, clients furious, boards involved. I kept my head down, sipping slowly. Back at home, my phone vibrated with a text from Chad. "Claire, let's not escalate this. We can come to an understanding. Call me." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and skimmed the latest headlines. Nothing about Verity yet, but the clock was ticking. Clients would talk, investors would notice, and the board, the real power, would not stay blind for long. At noon, a formal meeting request landed in my inbox. Legal and executive leadership, Verity HQ, 2 p.m. I accepted. Then I changed into a clean sweater, black slacks, low heels, nothing flashy but sharp enough to send a message. At 1:45, I arrived at Verity's building. The security guard looked up, startled, then buzzed me through without a word. The elevators were crowded with hushed conversations. I caught Maggie's eye as she slipped out on the 3rd floor. She gave a tiny nod, almost imperceptible, and vanished into the hallway. On the 7th floor, the air was thick with anxiety. Phones rang and rang. HR reps scurried past, arms full of folders. Someone had spilled coffee on the front desk, and no one had stopped to clean it up. A junior associate greeted me, his voice cracking as he led me to the conference room. I stepped inside and found the Verity legal team already assembled, faces pale and drawn. Chad was there too, standing stiffly by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. I didn't sit. Not yet. The general counsel cleared his throat. Claire, we appreciate you coming in. We'd like to resolve this amicably. I smiled, polite but distant. So would I. They slid a folder across the table, an offer. I opened it, scanned the numbers. Lower than my terms. No public acknowledgement. Conditions hedged and watered down. Amateurs. I placed the folder back on the table, unopened. I'm happy to discuss a fair agreement, I said, voice calm, but not under these terms. Chad spoke then, voice tight. You're being unreasonable. I met his gaze, unblinking. Number, I'm being accurate. The tension snapped like a stretched wire. Papers shifted, chairs scraped. The room shrank around us. As I clicked send on my response, I pictured Chad pacing the marble floors upstairs, and for once, he couldn't spin his way out. The executive floor smelled like panic, stale coffee, and something else, desperation. I shifted in the hard-back chair of the conference room, letting my fingers trace idle patterns against the polished wood table. Across from me, Chad perched stiffly on the edge of his seat, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against a legal pad that remained stubbornly blank. Around us, the legal team shuffled papers, whispered furiously, and cast furtive glances at each other. Even the general counsel, who normally projected the cool composure of a seasoned negotiator, looked like he needed a second cup of coffee, and maybe a stiff drink after. They had miscalculated, not just about the licensing, but about me. The windows rattled slightly with the gusts outside, Boston's October wind slicing through the alleys and pressing cold fingers against the glass. Down on the street, people hurried along, collars turned up, coffees clutched close to their chests, oblivious to the unraveling happening several stories above. Claire, Chad began, voice slick as black ice. This situation, it's not good for either of us. We're on the same side here. I smiled thinly. Interesting. I don't recall you mentioning that the day you fired me. He faltered just for a breath before pasting the smile back on. There were misunderstandings, miscommunications. We can work through this. The general counsel leaned in, cutting off Chad's meandering attempt at charm. We're prepared to offer a retroactive licensing extension at market rates, effective immediately. He slid a paper across the table. I didn't reach for it. I already knew what it would say: reduced terms, no public acknowledgement, a convenient sweep of the past under the rug. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. That's not acceptable. A flicker of frustration crossed Chad's face. Claire, be reasonable. I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. I am. You're the ones trying to renegotiate from a position you no longer hold. The general counsel coughed lightly. If you have a counterproposal, we're open to discussion. I let a beat of silence stretch between us before speaking. The proposal remains the same, $1.2 million for a year, renewable quarterly, public acknowledgement of patent ownership, clearly and formally. And if we decline, Chad said, his voice harder now, brittle at the edges. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of my answer fill the room. Then you explain to the board and your clients why your systems remain offline and why your investors are calling for audits. The tension thickened, a palpable thing. Chad's pen finally dropped from his hand, clattering loudly against the table. The general counsel rubbed his temple. We'll need to take this to the board. Of course, I said, standing smoothly. Take your time, but be aware. Every hour you delay costs your client trust, and trust, once broken, is harder to rebuild than servers. I gathered my bag, my notes untouched on the table. As I turned to leave, Chad stood too, blocking my path. You're burning bridges, Claire, he said, low enough that only I could hear. You won't find another company willing to work with you after this. I smiled, genuine and calm. Good thing I'm building my own. I pushed past him, my heels clicking a deliberate rhythm across the marble floor. The hallway outside buzzed with muted chaos, Assistants rushing between offices, IT staff on their phones, board members arriving early for emergency meetings. I slipped through the crowd like a ghost, unseen but felt, the tremor left behind in every glance and hurried whisper. Downstairs, I ducked into the corner cafe across the street, the warmth and cinnamon sugar smell wrapping around me like an old quilt. I ordered a black coffee and found a seat by the window, watching Verity's building loom across the rainy street. It was almost funny in a way. They had underestimated me so completely that even now, standing knee-deep in crisis, Chad still thought he could bluff his way through. But the thing about systems, whether technical or human, is that if you don't respect their architecture, eventually they collapse. An hour later, my phone buzzed. New email, Verity Systems Board, request for urgent meeting tomorrow morning. I sipped my coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through me. Tomorrow they'd call me into the boardroom. Tomorrow they'd scramble to salvage what they could. And tomorrow they would learn, too late, that some bridges are only burned by those who never deserve to cross them. By the time I stepped out of the boardroom, Chad's carefully polished facade had begun to crack. And this time, there was no fixing it. The announcement hit Verity Systems like a late autumn storm, sweeping, inevitable, and long overdue. I stood in the lobby, near the tall glass doors, the faint smell of wet concrete and printer toner filling the air. The overhead screens that usually displayed client metrics and corporate slogans now looped a simple static message: organizational update, effective immediately. The wording was crisp, sterile, and utterly devastating for the people it was about. I tugged my coat closer against the draft that seeped in with every revolving door spin. Through the glass, the city outside shimmered under the afternoon rain, lights blurring into soft halos against the puddled sidewalks. A text from Maggie buzzed in. It's official. Chad's out. I exhaled slowly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet release of someone who had been holding their breath too long. The board meeting that morning had been clinical. They reviewed the documents I'd provided, listened to the timeline, nodded at the hard facts Chad had tried so desperately to spin. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became. He hadn't just misunderstood the infrastructure, he'd misunderstood the people behind it. By 11 a.m., they had asked him to step outside. By 11:30, they had asked me to stay. We value what you've built here, the board chair had said, his voice surprisingly gentle. We regret that it took a crisis for us to recognize it properly. I nodded, careful to keep my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. Acknowledgement is a start, I said. They offered me a full-time return, of course, an open door, a new title, a new team. I declined politely. Instead, I proposed a consultancy agreement, short-term, high-impact, fully autonomous. I would help stabilize the systems, mentor whoever was brave enough to step into the architecture lead role, and leave behind better guardrails than the ones I had been forced to create alone. No more corporate games, no more fighting battles I never should have had to fight in the first place. As the final signatures dried on the paperwork, I found myself staring out the boardroom window at the gray Boston skyline. Somewhere down there, people bustled through their days, oblivious to the small shifts in power that shaped their digital lives. Back in the lobby now, I sipped a lukewarm coffee from the downstairs cafe and watched the tide of Verity employees drift past. Some curious, some relieved, a few offering me tentative nods or whispered congratulations. Maggie caught up to me near the elevators, her tote bag swinging against her hip. You did it, she said simply. I smiled. We did it. You kept me grounded when I wanted to set everything on fire. She laughed, the sound bright against the heavy air. You're a legend around here now, you know. They're calling you the firewall. I shook my head, amused. Not sure if that's a compliment. It is, she said, squeezing my arm. You didn't just protect the system, you protected us. The elevators dinged, and she disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone in the buzz and hum of the lobby. I pulled my coat tighter, walked out into the drizzle, and headed toward the corner diner. Inside, Mrs. Delaney was sliding pies into the front case, her silver hair escaping its bun. She looked up and grinned when she saw me. Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour, she said, pouring me a cup of black coffee without waiting for an order. Pumpkin pie is fresh out of the oven. You earned a slice. I accepted both gratefully and slid into a corner booth. The diner was half decorated for Thanksgiving already. Paper turkeys taped to the windows, a wreath of autumn leaves hanging above the door. I took a bite of pie, warm, spiced, just the right side of sweet, and let the comfort of it soak in. Across the street, the Verity building loomed, but it no longer felt heavy, no longer felt like something pressing down on my chest. It was just another place, just another chapter. I thought about the interns, about Maggie, about the quiet, stubborn resilience of people who kept the gears turning even when no one noticed. I thought about the system I had built, not just lines of code, but something sturdier, something that outlived bad leadership and careless ambition. And I thought about myself, not as the woman who had been dismissed, but as the woman who had decided what dismissal meant and what it didn't. The rain eased to a mist, soft against the glass. I pulled out a notepad from my bag and jotted down a few ideas, names for the consulting firm I was finally going to build. No more waiting for permission, no more asking for a seat at the table. As I pushed open the glass doors into Boston's chilly dusk, I realized, for the first time, I wasn't carrying the company's future on my back anymore. I was carrying my own. Sometimes it's not the noise we make, but the quiet strength we carry that defines our story. I learned that true value isn't always visible to those too busy looking only at surfaces, and that kindness, coupled with quiet resilience, can rebuild what arrogance tries to destroy. In a world eager to judge by appearances, a steady heart becomes its own kind of revolution. So if you ever wonder whether standing firm in your quiet worth matters, trust me, it does.